In 2018, I made a video prior to the release of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, ranking the 10 Assassin's Creed games we had at the time. And in retrospect, that video was a travesty. I hadn't played the games in a while, I had all sorts of awful placings, like the first game at 9th and Origins in the number 1 slot. Now, 2 years later, with 2 replays of the franchise in that time, and with Odyssey and Valhalla now released and under my belt, I thought I'd give an updated ranking of the 12 games that's more reflective of what I really think of them, and hopefully is less of a terrible mess of shitty takes. Before we get into it though, please hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos about video games, and if you enjoy the video, consider leaving a like. With that said, here's my ranking of the Assassin's Creed games from worst to best. At number 12, I have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, this placement should come as no surprise to anyone who's even vaguely familiar with my thoughts on this franchise. I wondered whether to put it on the list, as generally a requirement to be on an Assassin's Creed ranking list would be to be an Assassin's Creed game. But alas, the franchise's name is slapped on the box, so I guess we have to treat it as such. And yeah, I already know I'm going to get loads of comments telling me how I'm just a hater, blinded by nostalgia, that the new games are better, that I should just move on, but this video is just the opinion of myself, and this is simply what I think, so just find a way to deal with that if you're one of those people. For a start, there's no assassins in this game, there's no hidden blades unless you count the terrible Darius DLC, it's set before assassins was even a thing, there's no social stuff, nothing at all to affirm its position in the franchise, except some law-breaking encounters with the Isu and Pieces of Eden that barely holds up. So even if the core game was absolutely perfect, I probably couldn't rank it much higher than this on this list, which is a ranking of these games both as games themselves and as components of the Assassin's Creed franchise. It simply makes no effort, and it's clear that the game Ubisoft Quebec really wanted was their new Immortals Phoenix Rising game, but they were forced instead to make the more popular Assassin's Creed title. Even if you remove AC from it and just look at it as an RPG, it's a pretty poor one, forcing you to take a mind-numbing amount of time just to level your character up to advance the main story with an XP bar that moves at the pace of a snail with arthritis, unless you buy an XP boost from their store. Yeah, you heard that right, XP boosts in a single player game. The story is mediocre at best, the facial animations are all over the place with their junkiness, the game bogs you down with a huge amount of loot, massive health bars, and tedious points of interest that just bloat the game but add no depth to it whatsoever. Overall, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a lackluster RPG and a terrible Assassin's Creed game, and for that reason I can't rank it any higher than this on my list. At number 11, I have Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Syndicate ranks higher than Odyssey by virtue of actually having Assassin's Creed elements in an Assassin's Creed game, and not much else. Syndicate was basically just a fixed version of Unity, but with worse story and worse combat. It's the closest the franchise has ever gotten to the present day, but for some reason, instead of being a grim tale of a fight against oppression in Victorian London, it's some twisted comedy with jokes that rarely land, and a pair of protagonists of which neither were interesting. This game upsets me particularly because Victorian London was one of my most requested settings for Assassin's Creed, in part due to the serious tone I assumed it would bring, but they pissed up the wall doing this shitty song and dance of unfiltered cringe. Most of the story is comprised of fucking up some of London's infrastructure as Jacob, fixing the mess as Evie, and then laughing about it, which is a sort of fucked up cycle when you think about it and realise the repetitive cycle that you're in. The main villain is some odd, literal mustache swirler without a single redeemable quality, and he's not even a real historical figure. Speaking of historical figures, they're all forced awkwardly into this game for about 30 seconds to do what is basically the stealth action equivalent of a fetch quest, for them only to fuck off again. Gone are the days of Assassin's Creed 2 by this point, you know, where the most notable historical figure was Leonardo da Vinci and he was Ezio's best fucking friend. The combat is the worst here than it is any game in the franchise. It feels like it would be more in place in a fighting game full of absurd finishers and silly cartoonish moves. The grappling launcher is fun at first, because of course it is, but quickly you realise that in doing so it was weakening what was basically the franchise's main selling point at the time, the parkour. The carriages never felt fun to use, the enemies all look the same, and the best part about the game is its black box assassination missions, but even they were better and more open-ended in Unity. At least Syndicate is an Assassin's Creed game, however unfortunately that Assassin's Creed game is decidedly quite shit. At number 10 I have Assassin's Creed Rogue, We've crossed the territory of games that I actively dislike, and now we're at the part of the list I would categorise as meh. Not bad, but certainly not good, and I'd say that's a rather apt description of Rogue as a whole. It's hard to get excited for a game that effectively existed to be a consolation prize, or you don't have a console capable of running Assassin's Creed Unity. Here, have Black Flag, but with all the pirates and interesting and fun stuff taken out. This game can easily be beat in one setting, I know because I've done it, meaning, and I say this not as a measure of quality whatsoever, but you can beat Rogue about 15 times before you beat Odyssey or maybe Valhalla once. The premise is actually quite interesting, an assassin who defected to the Templars and now hunts them. The only thing is, this isn't as much a tale from the Templars' perspective as it is Templars pretending to be assassins and vice versa. Both factions act exactly how the opposite faction acts in the previous games, which is annoying because games like AC1, AC3 and AC Unity show the Templar perspective perfectly and make some sympathetic characters without making themselves angels and the assassins demons. Not only did they ruin their original characters with this, they ruined Adewale too, turning one of the series' most virtuous characters into effectively a villain with no reason or explanation. The modern day story is just completely pointless. The entire purpose of this game was apparently so Otsoberg could cyberbully the assassins over the time they were all wrong 250 years in the past. The story is all just a bit nonsensical and all over the place, and everything feels like it would be resolved if the characters had a civilized conversation over the problems they were facing. As for the gameplay, you can't really complain, it's just Black Flag gameplay with a few extra things tacked on. Unfortunately, most of them just feel like gimmicks or reskins, which was obvious of course, because none of Rogue's features actually made it into their actual next-gen game, Unity. Like the fact that you could be assassinated, your ship could be boarded, a bunch of new weapons like a fucking machine gun and a flamethrower on your 18th century tiny pirate ship for some reason. Unfortunately, even though it has the gameplay of Black Flag, it has none of the open world, simply a barren sea with islands decorated by pointless collectibles, and not much else. Don't expect any side quests or indeed anything meaningful except the main story. Overall, this is just a short, rather boring game, which will be fun for the one sitting that it actually takes to play it, but offers nothing that isn't available in a better format in other Assassin's Creed games. At number 9, I have Assassin's Creed Unity. There's a bit of a theme to these last 3 games, and simply that time of 2014 to 15 for Assassin's Creed in general, and that is wasted potential. Syndicate could have been a perfect Victorian London AC game, Rogue could have been a perfect Templar game, and Unity could have been the perfect way to lead the franchise going forward, but it got caught up on its major shortcomings, was heavily criticised, and as a result of that criticism, the franchise is now an RPG, rather than the stealth action game it was, due to how reactionary Ubisoft were to the response to Unity. Released as a completely buggy, broken mess, these issues still haven't completely been fixed today, with input lag, FPS drops and general bugginess and performance issues, even today, 6 years after the game was released. The story is alright, I mean compared to games like Odyssey and Syndicate, it's great, just by virtue of having a consistent tone, half alright pacing, and I cannot stress this enough, a good and clear focus on the assassins. This is pretty much the only next-gen AC title that puts the assassins at centre stage for the story. And the love story between Arno and Elise is decent, I don't hate it. I mean, Romeo and Juliet isn't the most original of plotlines, but for what it's worth it manages to keep the story afloat in its second half. The setting is really good, and the story uses that to its advantage. You get a real taste of how bloody revolutionary Paris could be at times, and the assassination targets are quite interesting. Just a shame that, like with Odyssey, there's no actual confessions, just weirdly being able to view your target's memories, a thing that isn't properly explained before, during, or after this game. The gameplay, however, is where I say this could have been the way forward for the franchise. When it works, asterisk, 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 it's actually really good. It's just a shame that it works about 1% of the time. The parkour is what usually gets the most compliments, and yeah, the parkour is really flashy, it looks good, it plays good when it wants to. The stealth is really good when it wants to be. The combat is really good when it wants to be. Are you sensing a theme here? The point is, if Unity actually fucking worked and had a really good story, everyone would be singing its praises about how it was a return to form for the franchise, how it was the best since the Ezio trilogy, and most importantly, Ubisoft would continue to make more Unities that work and aren't silly like Syndicate, rather than change course and ending up with this weird, messy role-playing genre. So for that reason, if nothing else, fuck you Assassin's Creed Unity, fuck you in particular, it's all your fault. At number 8, I have Assassin's Creed 3. You know, weirdly enough, before Odyssey came out, I remember when Assassin's Creed 3 was the most divisive game in the franchise. You either loved it or you hated it. And weirdly enough, I found myself in both camps at one point or another. Mainly, whenever I played the game off the back of the Ezio trilogy, I hated it, and whenever I played the game for what it is, I loved it. However, really, the game isn't deserving of your love or hate, it's more deserving of your passive interest while you play it, and not much else, because if we're being honest, if we compare Assassin's Creed 3 to what came after it now, and not what came before it at the time, it's rather alright. The game is saved mainly by its story, I think, which in spite of no actual likeable protagonist, does stay afloat by the protagonist's father, Haytham, who you play as for the first 3 hours of the game, and to be honest, he should have been the protagonist for the whole game. I'm not even kidding, outside of like Ezio and like maybe Eivor, he is my favourite character in this franchise. His pragmatism, British wit, charisma and intelligence is so appealing to me. And in terms of historical events, AC3 is certainly the Assassin's Creed game that has the most of them. Practically every level of the game has some town under siege or important document signed that I'm sure no one will ever use to justify owning literal killing machines in 200 years. But yeah, overall, the protagonist Connor is rather bland, even if his story is not, and the game really shined when you were taking part in the missions at the homestead, but unfortunately, most of that charm is nowhere to be seen in the game. As for the gameplay, well, the combat is certainly the highlight here, with Assassin's Creed adopting a very Batman Arkham-esque parry-based system, which certainly looks really flashy and it plays really good, and there's a fair amount of enemy variety, so the game isn't quite as simple as it looks. Unfortunately, it means a lot of the systems in the game have been watered down, particularly parkour and stealth, which both look better but function a lot more simplistically now, which is never a good thing for a supposed evolution of the franchise. There's a lot of new subsystems like naval, hunting and the Brotherhood system, but in all three of these cases, these systems are either poor precursors for the mechanics that will be properly implemented in future games, or a poor imitation of a feature that was a lot better in older games. You'll have a good time with AC3, but to expect much depth to the gameplay would be to disappoint yourself. AC3 is fun when you enjoy it for what it is, and not when you compare it to other games. At number 7, I have Assassin's Creed Origins. Now 2 years ago, I could not stop singing the praises of Assassin's Creed Origins. I even had it at my number 1 spot. Now, after Odyssey put this game in perspective for me, the cracks have started to show, and I realised what flaws this game has. The game is still quite good. I'd say this is the point in my ranking where the games cross from meh to good, but it would be remiss of me to compliment Origins for the same things I criticised Odyssey for. Having took a 2-year break from the franchise, Assassin's Creed was back as an RPG, or I guess you could call Origins a pseudo-RPG. A baby step, a step we didn't actually mind, it's just now we've walked about 10 miles on from that first step, and we're questioning whether we should have took it in the first place. The game tells the origin story of the franchise. Shocker, I know, and follows Medjay, Bayek of Siwa, as he goes on a classic revenge quest for his son. I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret, a secret I've only recently been privy to. The story in Origins isn't that good. It's fine, but Bayek carries it in my opinion. The protagonist is so well written and voice acted that it makes you forget about the cracks in the story. It's like a reverse AC3. It's a petty revenge quest that's been done before, with extremely forgettable side characters and even more forgettable villains, and the pacing, as is the case for all 3 of the RPG Assassin's Creed games, is very messy. All the important things happen at the beginning and end of the game, with not much but bloat between them. The big changes come with the gameplay, the introduction of a leveling system which, while not quite as bad as Odyssey, still leaves you grinding very repetitive side quests at times, and loot drops that are still quite frequent. The open world is really big, varied and pretty, though I really like Ptolemaic Egypt, and I will admit that this mythology trilogy does a really good job of immersing you in these worlds and time periods. The combat system is fine, it was the first game to introduce the Dark Souls style combat, and while I do prefer it over Odyssey, I also much prefer Valhalla's over this. Social stealth has been dropped, which is perhaps Origin's most egregious of mistakes, taking away a core pillar of the Assassin's Creed franchise. Origins didn't do anything punishingly bad, it's this weird limbo between old and new era Assassin's Creed, and as we've seen, if it was just Origins by itself, we probably wouldn't mind it. It's more that Origins wasn't a particularly outstanding game, and its only real purpose in this overall franchise was to slowly push fans towards this new RPG system without giving them pneumonia from the shock of Odyssey. But I'm not sure it did anything except delay the inevitable. Overall, Origins is fine, I enjoy it, but if what you love is Odyssey, you probably won't love this, and if what you love is the old games, you probably won't either. In short, Origins is a good game that set out to do what it meant to do, but to look back at it now, you realise it didn't completely please anyone either. At number 6, I have Assassin's Creed. The game that started it all. I had it ranked embarrassingly low in my last ranking, and honestly, I'd chalk that down to me being just 15 at the time, and it had been years since I had last played the first game completely. Now I can appreciate the nuance of the franchise more than I used to, and I can understand the game more than I could beforehand. The game was all about social stealth, about being a blade in the crowd, about philosophy and ideas, and most importantly of all, it was about the Assassin's Creed. The story is truly the main highlight here, a story I think a lot more people would appreciate if the game had proper cutscenes implemented. Slowly learning about your targets and what they've been doing to this holy land, talking with your targets about their philosophies and understanding their perspective, then returning to your mentor to discuss it as you learn more about the Assassin Brotherhood. The dialogue in this game is absolutely stellar, and the game tells a story of power and its ability to corrupt. Honestly, I don't even know how to describe my thoughts on this game. There's a certain eloquence to it. It feels like a piece of entertainment with something to say, an actual message, rather than the soulless garbage Ubisoft has churned out these last few years. However, it is of course the oldest Assassin's Creed game, and therefore it's a bit held back by its gameplay. The combat system was fine for its time, and the parkour and stealth systems were actually very innovative for the time. It's not these core gameplay elements that bogged the gameplay down. After all, it's the same core gameplay as the Ezio trilogy, and as I haven't gotten to any of them yet, they're obviously ranked higher than this. It's how they were implemented. The game's structure is very repetitive. Effectively, you'd go to a city, investigate one of the few repetitive ways to find information about your target, and kill him. This is all surrounded by a fun gameplay loop and a very engaging story, but that still doesn't change the fact that you're doing the same thing in every city 9 times until the game ends. So by the time you get to memory block 5 and 6, you're getting very bored. Obviously, there's really not much of the side content you'd expect in an Assassin's Creed game. While Assassin's Creed's story is excellent, you can tell how bare bones it was. It served as a glorified tech demo for Ubisoft for the next generation systems of the time, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and its sequel, Assassin's Creed 2, feels like it was what they always wanted to do, scope, structure and gameplay wise. Whilst there is a charm to it, its limitations and repetitive story structure prevents me from ranking it higher on this list. At number 5 we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the new kid on the block. Yeah, this is quite high considering what I said previously about Origins and Odyssey, and I don't think I'm knee-jerking my reaction here, but I think Assassin's Creed Valhalla is the best AC game we've had since Black Flag. Not just that, but I think it's the best game since Black Flag by quite a bit. Valhalla is the reactionary response to the last 2 Assassin's Creed games, an attempt to retain the RPG features of Origins and Odyssey, whilst retaining the elements of what makes it an Assassin's Creed game, and I think, mainly thanks to narrative director Darby McDevitt, it pulls this off. The story in this game is absolutely excellent. It's a true return to form for the franchise as it tells an emotional tale, and again the dialogue here is absolutely perfect. All of Darby's games get the dialogue absolutely nailed down, and this is no exception. We have a really talkative protagonist in Eivor, a protagonist that commands a room and isn't subservient as a lot of other AC protagonists are, and he speaks with a poetic beauty and eloquence unrivaled by any other protagonist. The story is told in an interesting structure, sending you into lands in search of alliances and back to your settlement, and majority of the side characters are well written and rather engaging, a thing that can't be said for any other game that came after Black Flag. The game also adds so much to the lore, so much richness of detail, all while being this massively huge experience like Origins and Odyssey. It has the vastness of those games and almost has the depth of the old ones. There are a few issues gameplay wise. The game can get a bit repetitive at times once you've figured out how all the systems work. Obviously the facial animations are a bit all over the place because when you've got a game this big, you can't do pre-rendered cutscenes all the time, and the game definitely suffers from that, and the parkour system is still nothing on the old games, and while it's no Unity, the game certainly suffers from its fair share of technical issues. Still though, and I think I'm in the minority when I say this, I love the combat system. It feels weighty, a bit of a challenge without making the enemies damage sponges, and every other system has been improved somewhat from Odyssey. It just feels like what this RPG genre of Assassin's Creed was always meant to be. Finally, after 3 games, they got it right. The exploration is organic, the world is alive, the graphics are beautiful. Unfortunately though, this was a game essentially made by the Assassin's Creed Dream Team, such as narrative director Darby McDevitt, and no creative director whatsoever. I said no creative director whatsoever. And I can't see something like this ever being replicated. It's a really good game. This is the first of the games on the list that I adore and I think are great, but it's a one-off experience. I'd be very surprised if this is the reawakening the franchise needs, unless they had this team making every Assassin's Creed game, which will never happen. No, we'll get Quebec's triannual turd with the name Assassin's Creed slapped on, and we'll be right back where we were in 2018. So yeah, Valhalla, I love you, you're the best game we've had in years, but the thought of a future without you makes me sad. At number 4, I have Assassin's Creed Revelations. So we've gotten to the Ezio games. In before everyone in the comments calls me an Ezio dick rider, if you can't understand why people love these games, I don't even know what to tell you, man. You're either 12 or you've never played them. This is the tail end of the Ezio trilogy, the one where you're playing as an older Ezio past his prime, in a search not for revenge or liberty like the previous 2 games in the trilogy, but for wisdom, and it all ties together with Altair and Desmond in a way that hasn't properly been done since. It's a game that solidified Assassin's Creed as a cohesive narrative with a direction that was heading somewhere, at least until the next game took a massive shit all over that notion. The story is the obvious highlight here. What Revelations lacks in gameplay innovations, it makes up for in a narrative, which, like the previous game on the list, was written by the man himself, Darby McDevitt. It brings a perfect conclusion to the story of Ezio and retroactively goes back and makes the first Assassin's Creed 10 times better by giving us a proper conclusion to the story of Altair. This was back when Assassin's Creed wasn't afraid to revisit its old protagonist and actually give them proper conclusions. I still don't know what happened to Connor or Shay or Arno or Bayek, but Ezio and Altair both got their perfect conclusion in this game. The scenes with Sofia are great, but I do feel as though the plot centering on the political situation in the region was quite weak when compared to the rest of the story, which is probably the only gripe I have with the narrative. The gameplay is definitely what holds it back. It's not bad, it's still the fun gameplay of the Ezio trilogy, but by this point, it's certainly getting a bit stale. There's nothing particularly noteworthy added to the game, most likely because they only had a year to develop it, and unlike Brotherhood, it wasn't made from unused assets from AC2. The parkour is still fine, the combat is actually a little more fun in my opinion. Ezio is a lot more brutal in this game than the previous 2. But they do try and tack on pointless minigames that no one really likes, like the dumb den defense, which luckily the game only makes you play once. There's also the grapple blade, which I really liked and found fun, but it still just felt like a gimmick since it's never been used since. All in all, this game is really carried by its story, and I actually genuinely think that Revelations has the best story out of any Assassin's Creed game, but its failure to innovate and push the boundaries stops me from pushing it ahead of the next 3 games on the list, all of which had excellent stories yet still managed to evolve the gameplay of Assassin's Creed. At number 3, I have Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Black Flag is like the universally loved AC. You get people divided about the Ezio trilogy, about the Mythology trilogy, about Unity, but the one thing that most Assassin's Creed fans seem to agree on is that Black Flag is great. Written by, you guessed it, Darby McDevitt, and having possibly the most fun gameplay we've seen so far in the franchise, Black Flag is a masterclass of a game that gets so much right and has already went down as one of the classics of its time just 7 years after its release. The last true Assassin's Creed game before a 7-year drought. All in all, this is just such a great game. The game is set, of course, during the golden age of piracy and tells the tale of Welsh-born privateer turned pirate Edward Kenway. It's a tale of loss, of regret, of how the road to wealth and power is not an easy one where you will lose many of the people you care about and many of the people who care for you. The side characters of this game are the best here in the franchise, everyone from Mary Read to Blackbeard to Stede Bonnet is a standout character, in some cases more memorable than protagonist Edward Kenway, who himself is extremely well written despite the modern day falling off the rails starting with this game. Unlike some games in this franchise, at least it's actually, well, there. The gameplay here is so fucking good, man. There isn't a better pirate game out there. Ubisoft has tried to make a spin-off based on the ship combat, but from what I can tell, the game seems like it's in development hell. The ship combat is so fun, you truly feel like a pirate as you take down the other ships and swing to them to finish off the enemy crew. This is undoubtedly the most fun you'll have in an Assassin's Creed game when not even doing anything, just dicking around, pillaging ships. The world is gorgeous when you consider this had to run on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and full of life and things to do. It's alive, it shows that Assassin's Creed can still have these amazing, well-received, massive open worlds without leaning completely into being a role-playing game. The main problem this game has is its level design. There are so many damn tailor missions in this game, and none of them are good. It's so finicky, man. Not only this, but there are literally multiple tailor missions in which you are in a ship. A fucking ship. I'm sorry if I don't feel very stealthy when in a fully armoured brigade with 16 cannons on either side, but I guess that's just a me problem. But these are minor gripes. On the whole, Black Flag is an amazing game, and if it wasn't for the absolute sheer quality of these next two games, and if it sorted out its level design a bit, it would easily hit the #1 spot. At number 2, I have Assassin's Creed 2. Well guys, if you're a fan of Assassin's Creed, no matter what game, you have this game to thank for where it's at today. Assassin's Creed 2 built this franchise and made it what it was by virtue of its amazing story, engaging gameplay, and, well, maybe not stunning visuals, but they were alright for the time. It holds a special place in the hearts of many, and many consider this their favourite Assassin's Creed game. I'm one of them. I regularly go back and forth between this game and my #1 spot, which you can of course guess by now, but that game beats it out by an inch, at least at the time of writing this video. For a start, the story. We follow everyone's favourite Italian nobleman Ezio Auditore da Firenze through Renaissance Italy from birth to age 40, and we watch as his family is taken from him, and what starts off as a quest for revenge evolves into a fight for freedom and against oppression, as Ezio grows, matures and wisens as the game spans on. This makes it immediately better story-wise than a game like Syndicate, which apparently all happens in the span of like 1 calendar year and has no emotional stakes whatsoever. All the side characters are excellent too, like Leonardo and Caterina Sforza and Uncle Mario. All of them are extremely well written, likeable and entertaining to be around. The game covers historical events in an organic way, making them part of the story. All round the story is just excellent, and for the life of me I can't find a single fault in it. As for the gameplay, it takes the existing gameplay from Assassin's Creed, refines it and presents it in a much better manner. The combat is obviously still quite basic and not so cinematic looking, but regardless it still plays well, and when facing several tougher enemies can offer quite a bit of a challenge. The cities are much better built for parkour now, something that also flows a lot better, and the open worlds now have some semblance of engaging side content, like the Assassin Tombs, which offer brilliant parkour puzzles. However, at this point the amount of side content was still somewhat limited, which would be fixed in the next game. Social stealth peaked in this game, the assassination missions are extremely fun, and overall the gameplay is just a great experience. Assassin's Creed 2 was an amazing game with an amazing story, with its only limits being its lack of major progression in the modern day, and not a great deal of content outside of the game's main sequences. However, these problems would both be fixed by the next game, and my pick for the #1 spot. At number 1 I have Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Take everything I just said about Assassin's Creed 2 and imagine it in this game, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, only with a multiplayer, a new Brotherhood system which allows you to manage your own League of Assassins, an amazing villain, a better combat system and graphics. Doesn't that just sound like the perfect Assassin's Creed game? That's what we got 10 years ago, and it's, in my opinion, the best Assassin's Creed game we have ever gotten, bar none. It's a perfect sequel to Assassin's Creed 2 and builds on every good thing that was in the last game. The story continues the tale of Ezio, now a middle-aged man, less naive, wiser, stronger, and the experienced leader of the Assassin Brotherhood. The villain is Cesare Borgia, possibly the best in the series, with a hate him so much you love him vibe. The modern day in this game is the best in the franchise. It adds so much to the lore, has so many shocking moments, and sets up the events to come for Desmond and co in the next two games. The side characters continue to shine, especially Machiavelli and secondary antagonist Lucrezia Borgia. The story isn't maybe as strong as it is in 2 and Revelations, but that doesn't mean it's not excellent, and its advancements in gameplay more than make up for that. For a start, the new combat system is a refined version of the old one, but they managed to make it feel a lot more fluid and engaging. Even the graphics are a significant step up, particularly with the face models. The Brotherhood system is so fun, it makes the game truly feel like an Assassin's Creed game down to the gameplay. It's so fun to have your own assassins and have them help you take enemies down and send them on missions. It's surprisingly in-depth too. The ability to renovate Rome is also really good. It gives the players something to work towards. The city of Rome is one of the best cities we've ever seen in an Assassin's Creed game, and this was when Assassin's Creed really started to diversify in its side content. You had Christina memories, you had the tombs of Romulus, you had the Borgia forts to take down, and so much more. Truly, Brotherhood was Assassin's Creed at its pinnacle, and its tone, structure, gameplay, and story quality in every game in the franchise should strive to be like this one. If we could have more Assassin's Creed Brotherhoods and less Assassin's Creed Odysseys, I'll be a very happy man. And for that reason, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is my #1 pick. Well guys, that's my complete list of Assassin's Creed games from worst to best. If you disagree, please don't get too mad at me, this is just my opinion. I don't claim to speak for the wider community or anyone else. Instead, comment your ranking and tell me how you would place the Assassin's Creed games. If you enjoyed the video, again, I'd be really happy if you could drop a like and subscribe for more gaming related videos. With that said, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.